Yeah.
He's here. Orko's here.
Yeah.
Shudesha is here.
Shudesha?
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
And our students
Yes,
are
I'm
also
here.
sir.
Yeah.
Good morning, all.
Prashanto? Prashanto is probably...
Prashanto is
He's
here
coming.
yet.
He's coming.
Maybe he'll join in later.
Yes, yes. He will be joining in a few minutes.
Because I got used to his whistling.
You're one of the...
Good morning, sir. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
It's 11.
Yes.
If, Dr. Chattopadhyay and Professor Dhar, with their permission, should we start?
Yes, yes, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, right?
Yes.
Moni Kinkini,
Yes.
is the voice okay now?
Yes. I've just started the recording on. I think we should start.
Okay, you just give me the signal because it's still...
Go ahead. Emma.
Perfect?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Fine, thank you. Before we start, can I request everyone to mute their microphones, please? Because sometimes we get an echo. Orko, if you please mute your microphone.
I'll just do it for him. I think he's streaming it live, so I'll just do it for him.
Okay. Moni, can you just check if everyone's microphone is on mute?
Yeah, yes, I'll do. Yeah. Okay, we are on recording and yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. Good morning to everyone and a very warm welcome. Our distinguished guests, we are blessed to be joined by our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Dhruvajyoti Chattopadhyay, of course, the mentor and advisor, as well as the director of mentor and advisor of the English Department and the director of the School of International Languages, Professor Dr. Shubhi Dhar. Our distinguished guests, Dr. Gupta, and I'm sure we are joined by many other eminent faculty members and scholars. So, good morning and welcome the distinguished guests, participants, presenters, all of you. Welcome to this joint endeavor by Department of English, Sister Nivedita University, and School of International Languages, Sister Nivedita University, that is SIL, to this 3-day event called a clustered webinar on Rabindranath Tagore in English, poetry, prose, and drama. Now, why a clustered webinar and why 3 days? Of course, Professor Shubhi Dhar would be talking about it perhaps, but as you all may well imagine, an august figure like Rabindranath Tagore with contributions to myriad aspects of literature and art can hardly be discussed in a 1-day seminar, let alone in a 3-day seminar. It takes a lifetime of study and discussion and research. But nevertheless, we have put in our humble effort, and therefore, day 1 has been dedicated to Tagore's poetry, day 2 to Tagore's prose, and day 3 to Tagore's drama. Before anything else, I would like to invite our Honorable Vice Chancellor to please start the inaugural address. Sir, if you would please inaugurate the event for us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, Madhu Chanda and Professor Dhar and my very good friend, Professor Dasgupta, Sanjukta Dasgupta. We are friends from almost presidency days. That's almost, I don't know for how long we are together, and then jointly worked in Calcutta University, and also we visited several places together also. And we have so many of our faculty friends over here, and also the faculty friends from the other universities and colleges, and student participants, the other distinguished speakers and guests are going to join with us. I think the way Madhuchanda explained the reason for this clustered webinar for 3 days is really a very nice way of presenting the conceptually what is behind this. So when we look at Rabindranath Tagore, so we have to go through this prose, this songs and poetries, and definitely the drama. So I'm sure that today we are going to say poetry, but it's a combination of songs and poetry. Now, while actually, you know that Rabindranath Tagore is from my childhood days, is a very close to my heart. And the way actually in my house, my upbringing is with it, that it looks like I know only one God, that is Rabindranath Tagore, one Thakur, which is Rabindranath Tagore, in that way. And that's how actually the practices and everything in my whole family been done. Later on, when I started understanding the things, every day I realized that it's different. Specific things which is at my teenage is almost changed during my 40s and absolutely changed after 60s. The interpretations are so different right now, and each and every age demands a different look for these things. If it is poetry, if it is prose, or it is drama. And the thing what I thought that, you know, that one thing, one of my very close relative, who is actually a statistician, he actually thought about translating some of the poetries. All of you know that from the Bengali Gitanjali, out of the 157, only 51 is there in the English one. The rest of these are from in the Gitanjali English translation are from somewhere else. And Rabindranath, when started translating this in 1912, it's accidental because he is supposed to go to London, but because of his ill health, he could not, and he stayed back in Shilaidaho, and on river Padma River, he started translating this particular poetry. And then on 27th May 1912, Rabindranath actually took all his manuscripts to London and reached there on 16 June when he handed over to his friends William Rothenstein the whole manuscript. And after that, all of you know that William Rothenstein helped with Yeats to get it published. The Indian Society of London, they published it. Now, when I find it out, the coming into notice striking, but usually unnoticed analogous character of perception, reflective of alluring, overwhelming, humbling mystery of the cosmos, between the fields of science and that of literature, both poetry and the prose, and spirituality without any stamp of formal religious denomination. Now, this came to notice while looking at or reading it, that the perception of pioneer insight givers like Einstein, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Bohr, and others in the field of science about ever approximate, uncertain, or the provisional character and limitations of the scientific insights, the insights which paved the way for today's about nature and universe. I just want to I cannot actually resist myself just to recite one of my very, very favorite poem, which is more often referred to as songs, Akash Bhara Surya Tara. The sky studded with suns and stars, the universe throbbing with life. In its very midst, I have found my place. So my songs swell up in wonder. The wave of eternity on which sways the world of ebb and flow. Flow of blood through my vein is under its pool. So my songs swell up in wonder. On my way through the forest path, I have stepped on grass to grass, wonder-struck by the smell of flower. My mind is besides itself. The very gift of joy is scattered all around. So my songs swell up in wonder. I have laid my ears, opened my eyes, have poured my life on earth, have sought the unknown inside the known. So my songs swell up in wonder. And that's how Rabindranath to me. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to Professor Dhar, Professor Madhuchanda, and all others for giving me this opportunity. Thank you. Namaskar.
Sir, thank you so much. As always, your words are enriching and enlightening. Thank you so much for inaugurating this event for us. And before we proceed further, I would invite Professor Dr. Shubir Dhar to say a few words. Oops, sorry for that. My phone. So, if Professor Dr. Shubir Dhar would say a few words before we proceed further.
Yes, Dr. Rajchodri, I will just say a few words, not to spend too much time for it. First of all, it's a doubly delightful day for us at DESNU and the School of International Languages, SNU-SIL University. It's doubly delightful because, first of all, we have our own Vice Chancellor, Professor Dhruvajyoti Chattopadhyay, Professor Dr. Dhruvajyoti Chattopadhyay with us, and it was a delight to listen to him. You see, he is a man of science, like we all know, but in the traditions of the best education of India, he's a person who straddles two worlds. He may be a person who's very distinguished in his own discipline, but he's also a person who is very well informed and a person who is open to the nuances of literature. So thank you very much. And if I may say so, he's one of the most encouraging vice chancellors, most supportive vice chancellors, and certainly one of the most visionary vice chancellors that I've seen in my whole life. So thank you very much, sir. The other reason why...
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. The other reason why this is a delight is because my very good friend, Sir Dr. Sanjukta Dasgupta, is with us. We've been knowing each other for a very long time. And we were, in our... And we have kept in touch over the years. And there are many things that we have shared. And so thank you, Sanjukta, for being with us today. The formal thanks will be coming later on. But right at the moment, I just wanted to record my appreciation for giving us your time, the benefit of your erudition, and most importantly, the warmth of your friendship. And Dr. Rajchodri, it's all yours now. I didn't take too many words, I hope.
Of course not, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. And I think I should go ahead and introduce our...
Thank you.
Our keynote speaker of the day. As many of you probably already know, Professor Dr. Sanjukta Dasgupta's achievements are profuse. So let me just read out a very brief sketch of Dr. Sanjukta Dasgupta. I'm sure most of you know her, but nevertheless. So Professor Dr. Sanjukta Dasgupta was a professor and a former head of the Department of English and former Dean, Faculty of Arts, Calcutta University. She has been the recipient of Fulbright Postdoctoral Fellowship and Fulbright Scholar in Residence Grant, Australia, India Council Fellowship, Gender Studies Fellowship Grant, University of British Columbia, among many others. She has been invited to participate in conferences and teach or lecture at universities in the USA, UK, Europe, Canada, and Australia. She was a chairperson of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize jury panel from 2003 to 2005 at Melbourne and Malta in 2004 to 2005. The Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, invited her as a visiting professor to deliver a series of talks on Tagore, nation, and gender. She was granted the Charles Wallace Trust UK Translator Fellowship to work on her project on Tagore's daughters at the University of East Anglia, Norwich, UK. She was the co-principal investigator of the India-US Knowledge Initiative program, working on women entrepreneurs engaged in eco-friendly business. And in this connection, she visited several states in the US in 2016 and 2017. She is the President, Executive Council of the Indian Poetry and Performance Library, ICCR, Kolkata. In 2018, Sahitya Academy, New Delhi, nominated her as the convener of the English Language Board and as a member of the General Council. In 2018, again, she taught in Poland as visiting professor at the Jagiellonian University, Krakow, Poland. She received the IWSFF Women Achievers Award in Kolkata in 2019. Apart from all these distinctions, Professor Dasgupta is also a poet, a short story writer, a critic, a translator, and her published books include the novels of Huxley and Hemingway, a study in two planes of reality responses, selected essays, snapshots, that is poetry, Dilemma, which is a poetry collection, First Language, which is also a poetry collection, More Light, again a poetry collection. Then there are her stories in translations, Moni Mohesh, which is a translation, The Indian Family in Transition, which is co-edited by with Sage, Media, Gender and Popular Culture in India, Tracking Change and Continuity, which is also something that she co-authored, published by Sage. Tagore, At Home in the World, again, she was a co-editor of this collection in 2013. Radical Rabindranath, Nation, Family and Gender in Tagore's Fiction and Films. Again, she was a co-author of this work, published by Orient Black Swan. Swadesh, Tagore's Patriotic Songs. She was translated this collection, published by Vishwabharati Publication Division. Abuse and Other Short Stories. Again, it has been published by her own book company. Towards Tagore, a collection of essays, which was edited with an introduction and published by Vishwabharati. Golpo Sankolon, translated contemporary Bengali stories. This was published by Sahitya Academy, New Delhi in 2016, and the second edition came out in 2018. Lakshmi Unbound, which is her poetry collection, 2017. And Claiming Space for Australian Women's Writing, which she co-edited, and which has been published by Pan Macmillan in 2017. And finally, Sita's Sisters, which is a poetry collection published in 2019. Her area of interest, obviously, if it is any surprise, given what I've read of her myriad publications, range in a wide array of disciplines. Post-colonial theory and texts is one area. Colonial and post-colonial women's writing, gender studies, migration and diaspora studies, literature and film studies, women in Indian films, translation studies, and creative writing. Awaiting publication is In Memoriam, English translations of Tagore's poems in Swaran and Palataka. So we are indeed privileged to have Sanjukta ma'am as our keynote speaker today. Before I say something else, I'll just remind people of a few practical things. First of all, as I said in the beginning, if you could all keep your microphones on muted mode. Presenters, when we will call out your name, and when we call out your name, you can unmute yourself and start presenting. Please remember that each presenter has 15 minutes to present with a 5-minute Q&A. So you have a total time of 20 minutes. We would earnestly request all of you to keep within your given time frame, as you know that if you leak into go beyond your time frame, you leak into somebody else's time frame, and that defers the whole event a little bit. So in order to help you, our student coordinator would give you a warning, a very friendly warning, obviously, because we are all very friendly people at DESNU and SIL. A very friendly warning in the chat box at 15 minutes. At 17 minutes, you would be given a verbal reminder to wrap your paper up. So those are the logistics. And I will call out the name of the paper presenters, and then you can go ahead and present one by one. But what I'm really also excited about, and what I was kind of keeping under wraps for so long, is that Professor Dr. Sanjukta Dasgupta has not only agreed to be our keynote speaker, but she has also, to our delight, agreed to chair this session on Rabindranath Tagore's poetry. So without any further ado, I invite Professor Dr. Sanjukta Dasgupta to take up the session, please. Ma'am, welcome.
Sanjukta, your audio is muted. Could you please unmute it?
Okay. Can you hear me? Audible?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm so obedient. When you asked me to switch off, I did. And I forgot to switch it on. So, thank you, Modhachanda, for that very generous introduction. I'm absolutely embarrassed.
Oh, not at all.
And I am also delighted this morning to be part of this very important webinar, more important for me because of the presence of a friend of mine from the presidency days. And we don't even want to mention the number of decades because you probably will collapse on the floor if you hear that. So we have been, and then we have worked together at the Calcutta University. And of course, Shubir Dhar also, the first time we met, we can't mention that. But since then, we have been great friends. And so the Vice Chancellor and the Director of the Faculty of English, both of them are present today, and their invitation was something that made me do a lot of homework. I suppose somehow post-retirement, people seem to be setting me homework like more regularly than when I was in full-time teaching. And of course, I also find that often my students also set me homework and ask me to deliver within 5 days or something. So I'm delighted today, and of course, delighted also because of the choice of topic. And as mentioned by by your Vice Chancellor and my friend Dhruvo, that Rabindranath has been a part of our lives like an invisible member of the family since I guess we were born. And that's the only Thakur that we really know of. And that probably is something that we need to instill in the new generations of young people in Bengal and throughout India. Because Rabindranath cannot be somebody who you can sort of marginalize by saying that, oh, he had his day, because he also passed on during the colonial times in 1941. Because I think every line of Rabindranath has a resonance and a relevance even to this day. And every line really is not an exaggeration. I would think that any thinking individual will find that Rabindranath is a support, is an inspiration, and also enables us to aspire to heights which within our very, very mundane, ordinary, regular lives, we are unable to transcend without some sort of iconic figure inspiring us to do so. And in that case, I think Rabindranath is the beacon, the trailblazer, the pathfinder for most thinking individuals. My paper today will address what my friend Dhruva has already anticipated what I will say. And so he probably, being a biochemistry person, he knows everything. And so he anticipated my paper and referred to the fact that Tagore, before going to London, made his first translations in Shilaidar. So I don't want to go into all that. But I'll just start in an anecdotal way too by referring to the fact that Tagore and the Irish poet W.B. Yeats met for the first time on June 27, 1912, at the home of the painter William Rothenstein. Rothenstein had previously sent Yeats the manuscripts of Tagore's partial translation of the Gitanjali. On July 7th, Yeats gave a reading of these poems to a group of thrilled literati of London, including Ernest Rhys and Ezra Pound. This is one of the 3 poems transcreated by Tagore that Yeats read, and I'm reading out now. Quote, "In the deep shadows of the rainy July, with secret steps thou walkest, silent as night, eluding all watchers. Today the morning has closed its eyes, heedless of the insistent calls of the loud east wind and a thick veil that has been drawn over the ever-wakeful blue sky. The woodlands have hushed their songs, and doors are all shut at every house. Thou art the solitary wayfarer in this deserted street. O my only friend, my best beloved, the gates are open in my house. Do not pass by like a dream." Unquote. A member of the audience, poet and writer May Sinclair, wrote a letter of effusive appreciation to Tagore. May Sinclair's insightful comment is remarkably significant in terms of the efficacy of translation in enabling cultural communication and cultural transfer. So Sinclair wrote, I quote, "You have put into English, which is absolutely transparent in its perfection, things it is despaired of ever seeing written in English at all, or in any Western language." So what we are looking at is cross-fertilization, both linguistic and cultural. Yeats thereafter hosted a dinner in honor of Tagore at a restaurant in London on July 10th. While proposing a toast to honor Tagore, Yeats said, I quote again, "To take part in honoring Mr. Rabindranath Tagore is one of the great events in my artistic life. I have been carrying about with me a book of translations into English prose of 100 of his Bengali lyrics written within the last 10 years. I know of no man in my time who has done anything in the English language to equal these lyrics. Even as I read them in English in this literal prose translation, they are exquisite in style as in thought." Once again, cross-fertilization. Tagore responded to Yeats's tribute by stating with remarkable candor, "This is one of the proud life. I have a speaking acquaintance with your glorious language, yet I can feel it in my own. My Bengali has been a jealous mistress, claiming all my homage and resenting rivals. Still, I have put up with her exactions with cheerful submission. I could do no other. I cannot do more than assure you that the unfailing kindness with which I have been greeted in England has moved me far more than I can tell. I have learned that though our tongues are different and our habits dissimilar, at the bottom, our hearts are one. The monsoon clouds generated on the banks of the Nile fertilize the fair distant shores of the Ganges. Ideas may have to cross from east to western shores to find a welcome in men's hearts and fulfill. East is east and west is west. God forbid that it should be otherwise, but the twain must meet in amity, peace, and understanding. Their meeting will be all the more fruitful because of their differences. It must lead both to holy wedlock before the common altar of humanity. So, our concept of sameness and difference had been anticipated by Tagore way back in 1912. In other words, we are perhaps also addressing the duality of Tagore's creative identity, focusing on the use of language for communication and language for creative expression. A ghore baire, known, unknown, familiar, unfamiliar binaries of the existential being, the tension of self-identity, the English Tagore and the Bengali Thakur, and the reception of the respective creative texts. We are aware that the control over culture by forces of imperialism through the displacement of native languages and the installation of the standard language of empire has been integral to colonization of the mind. The post-colonial theorist Bill Ashcroft had observed the unshakable link between our language and us has made language not only the most emotional site for cultural identity, but also one of the most critical techniques of colonization and of the subsequent transformation of colonial influence by post-colonized societies. As Tagore remained a prolific bilingual writer throughout his life, the tension between the Desi Thakur and his Bhasha literature and the global Tagore and his writings in English was never regarded as an act of cultural betrayal, despite the fact that English in British India was a signature language of imperialism and thankfully now is regarded as a deterritorialized global lingua franca. The primary reason for this was that Tagore continued to write in Bengali throughout his life, along with writing in English. He realized that if he had to reach a larger readership, a global language like English would be a functional tool that would make him engage in a dialogue with the world. According to many Tagore scholars, one compelling reason for this bid to introduce himself and his texts, specifically his philosophic, mystical reflections written in English to the world, was primarily because he needed to raise funds for the maintenance of his dream project, Vishwabharati University, which he did tirelessly by undertaking multiple international lecture tours, which even probably had a very strong influence on his repeated bad health. In a Sahitya Academy organized conference on Tagore's English writings held at Kochi some years back, the president of Sahitya Academy then, Sunil Gangopadhyay, unequivocally that there can be no fair competition between the Bengali writings of Tagore that comprise 33 volumes, whereas the English writings of Tagore comprise 4 volumes that include many translations by the poet himself. So it would be rare for Bengalis to prefer reading Tagore in English rather than in Bengali. Sahitya Academy's 4 volumes titled The English Writings of Tagore is, of course, a commendable initiative, as it validates the fact that Tagore could write creatively in not only Bengali, but in English as well. Volume 1 of the English writings deal with translations, or more appropriately, Tagore's transcreations from his own Bengali poems, sometimes even fusing lines and images of 2 or more Bengali poems in order to create one English poem. 3 volumes have been edited by Shishir Das of the English Writings of Tagore, and the 4th volume has been edited by Nityapriya Ghosh, in case you are interested in browsing through these volumes. Apart from the English Gitanjali, the poems of Tagore written or transcreated in English include The Gardener, The Crescent Moon, Fruit Gathering, Lover's Gift and Crossing, The Fugitive, Stray Birds, Fireflies, The Child, 100 poems of Kabir, among others. In fact, there are 17 poems in Crossing which seem to be poems written directly in English, as no Bengali poems could be located by Tagore scholars that even remotely resemble the content or style of these poems. Shishir Das, the editor of the 3 volumes of Tagore's English writings, admits the difficulty of correctly identifying the Bengali poems from which Tagore may have transcreated the English versions. Some, he conjectured, may have been originally written in English and were not rewritings of Bengali poems into English. In a letter from London, dated May 12, 1913, to his friend Ajit Kumar Chakraborty, Tagore had stated, and I quote, "The forms and features of the original become difficult in my translations, the way I do them these days. My translations are more a reflection than an exact replica of the original image." One great advantage of being a poet translator and who translates his own poems, that you can take all the liberty in the world. Try doing that with somebody else's poetry. And so Shishir Das had also commented, "It is not easy to identify the Bengali sources of all the poems that Tagore translated into English. His translations are not always faithful to his own Bengali." Later, in response to the poet James Henry Cousins' letter about his translated poems that he had sent to Cousins for his views, Tagore wrote, "About the Englishness of my English, I have to be careful, as the language is not my own. But about ideas, I think it is best to have a definitely independent attitude of mind, where the mind is without fear." Yes? Therefore, the need for translations become imperative, for not all can read Bengali. In other words, if cultural transfer or inter-transfer is an objective of creative texts, then translations into a dominant language like English are essential for a complete understanding of the multifaceted creative genius of Tagore. This is an aspect that the English writings of Tagore underscore, for these writings arouse curiosity and desire for knowing all that Tagore has not written in the English language. In other words, we need to re-emphasize the need for translations, and not just translations, but critically informed introductions to those translations as well. Shishir Das refers to this mode of the mystery of creativity and activity of translation, implying that if the first is an aesthetic art, the other is aesthetic craft. It is therefore relevant again to quote another of Tagore's letters addressed to Ajit Chakraborty, where he states, "My English emerges out of my subconscious. Once I mount the peak of conscious will, all my wit and wisdom get muddled. That is why I cannot gird up my loins to do a translation. I can only set my boat adrift and not sit at the helm at all. Then, if when I touch shore, I cannot quite understand how it all happened. So for him, it is a journey by boat down a river in terms of translating and transcreating. Tagore seems to hint at the fact that the craft of translation can be as inspirational as the art of poetry writing. It should be noticed that Tagore was being awarded the Nobel Prize as a British subject. The prize did not celebrate the ethnic language Bengali, but focused on the English language version without even a cursory reference to the Bengali language and culture, and quite unequivocally stated that Tagore had imbibed both the culture and language of the West that had been unmistakable contributing factors that nurtured his talent and creative genius. This happened on the 10th of December 1913, when the prize was awarded to him. As a matter of fact, the complete Nobel banquet speech that was read out on the evening of the award ceremony is politically nuanced and an interesting area for researchers to investigate. A few particular references for the presentation speech made by Harold Yarney, chairman of the Nobel Committee, may be interesting. Identifying the contribution of the Christian missionaries in their endeavors to fertilize the cultural and literary landscape of the vernacular cultural traditions, thereby generating fresh bubbling spring of living water in Bengal, the speech elaborated, I quote, "It was in Bengal, the oldest Anglo-Indian province, and the scene many years before of the indefatigable labors of that missionary pioneer Carey to promote the Christian religion and to improve the vernacular language that Rabindranath Tagore was born to in 1861, unquote. At the same time, the banquet speech highlighted Tagore in his role of a cultural missionary, spreading the message of humanitarian goodwill filtered through his inherited ancient traditions and the edifying influence of Christianity, which is regarded to be internalized within the doctrines of the Brahmo Samaj and its religious practices. So the speech stated, I quote, "To carry out his life's work, Tagore equipped himself with a many-sided culture, European as well as Indian, extended and matured by travels abroad and by advanced study in London," unquote. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, delivered much later, as you all know, he could not go to Stockholm in 1913 on the 10th of December to receive the award. He went much, much later in 1921 to Stockholm. And there, in his much delayed speech and deferred speech, Rabindranath Tagore stated, "After my Gitanjali poems had been written in Bengali, I translated those poems into English without having any desire to have them published, being diffident of my mastery of that language. But I had the manuscript with me when I came to the West. I was accepted, and the heart of the West opened without delay." Interestingly, when the poet T.S. Eliot was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948, though he wrote in English, Eliot foregrounded the importance of cultural transfer through poetry and language. So Eliot stated in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, this is really demands our attention. Eliot stated, "To enjoy poetry belonging to another language is to enjoy an understanding of the people to whom that language belongs. an understanding we can get in no other way. And I take the award of the Nobel Prize in Literature, when it is given to a poet, to be primarily an assertion of the supranational value of poetry. Unquote. Rabindranath Tagore proved that he could not only create literature in the colonizers' language, English, but even secure the Western world's most coveted prize, the Nobel Prize for Literature, while simultaneously he untiringly continued to write in his own indigenous language, Bengali, with equal felicity. I will conclude by stating that I would urge you to notice that Tagore, throughout his literary career, did not compromise on the writer's vision and ideology under either local or global coercion, irrespective of his choice of language as a medium of communication and cultural connectivity. Thank you for your patience and indulgence.
Thank you so much, Sanjukta Di. And may I call upon our first presenter, Sanjukta Di, if you have the list of presenters. The first presenter was supposed to be Debopriya Banerjee, but unfortunately she could not join us today because of health reasons. It's not COVID, we are being assured, thankfully. So we move on to our second presenter, who is Annesha Rai, lecturer, Bashanti Devi College, Kolkata. And her paper is entitled 100 Poems by Kabir, Probing into Tagore's Purpose in Translating Kabir to English. And may I also at this point introduce our student timekeeper, who is Shreyoshi Ghosh. So, Annesha, could you unmute yourself, please?
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, you are. And could you turn your video on if that's not possible? If it's okay, yeah, I can see you. Yes, absolutely. Yes, go ahead. Yes, I'll let Sanjukta Di take over now.
Annesha, your topic is 100 Poems by Kabir, probing into Tagore's purpose in translating Kabir to English. Tell us a bit about yourself and then you read the paper, okay? And you know the time, and the timekeepers are very vigilant. They have warned you earlier. I was also on tenterhooks. I don't know how many extra minutes I took up, but
the time wasn't for allotted. Wasn't for you. It was for the speakers, ma'am.
Okay, go ahead, Annesha.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm Anvesha Ray, and I am a lecturer at Bashanti Devi College. In 2019, I completed my master's in English from St. Xavier's University. And my paper is on Tagore's translation of Kabir's poems. Rabindranath Tagore's Jibon Debota, the absolute infinite cosmic power, is the artistic personal, as Tagore stated, and is intimately connected to his idea of man, both ultimately grounded to an essence of creativity. Jibon Debota, being the absolute whole, the synthesis of existing worldly components and beyond, revealed himself in the blend of myriad strains in Tagore's art. Classifying his compositions thus become a complex process, as apparently a love song is often found to be belonging to the segment of devotion or nature in Gitobitan. Hence, it is not shocking to discover political implications in an acutely devotional composition as 100 Poems of Kabir and Tagore's religious insights. Nevertheless, one is intrigued to plunge deeper, to probe into the purpose behind such doctrinal amalgamation. In 1915, 2 years after winning the Nobel Prize for Gitanjali, Tagore endeavored upon selecting and translating 100 verses composed by the 15th century Bhakti poet and philosopher Kabir. 100 Poems of Kabir automatically garnered immediate attention owing to Tagore's international fame as a Nobel laureate. Tagore's idea of God was firmly rooted in the idea of syncretism, As Michael Collins notes in his book Empire, Nationalism and Post-Colonial World, Rabindranath Tagore's writings on history, politics and society, and I quote, "The phenomenology of direct emotional experience conveys the deep conviction that God and man, as well as man and nature, are fundamentally not in a relationship of opposition and antagonism. Since the idea of creativity and the everyday world are thus central to any understanding of Tagore's philosophy, he felt a deep and soulful connection with Kabir and his version of bhakti by virtue of similitude. Convergence in the philosophical panorama of the two poets born about 3 centuries apart can be witnessed through a close reading of 100 poems of Kabir and Gitanjali, where the first provides a semblance of smooth continuity of the latter. Akshaya Kumar opined in his paper translating Bhakti versions of Kabir in colonial or early nationalist period, this paper was published by Sahitya Academy, that while reading, and I'm quoting, while reading Tagore's translation, it becomes difficult to make out as to where Kabir ends and Tagore the poet takes over. One can read a verse of Gitanjali and a translated song of Kabir simultaneously as natural extensions of each other without any sense of rupture or deviance of mood. The apparent purport of Tagore's translation appeared to be internationalization of Kabir's poetic art and his discourse on devotion. The fact that it was just the superficial motive has been noted by Professor Shukanta Chaudhary, a well-known Tagore scholar as well. He observes, and I quote, "Their surface intent is to disseminate and institutionalize the poet's work abroad." Unquote. However, assertion of Tagore's dualistic impetus is possible through a circuitous analysis of Tagore's nationalist views and the contemporary situation of India under the British rule. Tagore's propensity for the mystical Kabir is understandable both in terms of his own strong personal inclinations for the metaphysical and in terms of the cultural imperatives of age in which he was writing, notes Kumar. Tagore instrumentalized Kabir's poems to establish the superior merit of Indian philosophy and to counter the communal violence in India initiated by the provocative British governmental policies. Amartya Sen noted in his book, The Argumentative Indian, and I quote, "In this context, it is important to emphasize that Rabindranath was not short of pride of India's own heritage and often spoke about it. He lectured at Oxford with evident satisfaction on the importance of India's religious ideas, quoting both from ancient texts and popular poetry, such as the verses of the 16th century Muslim poet Kabir. He also mentioned the poet's growing anxiety about the communal segregation in his society. And I quote, Rabindranath would be shocked by the growth of cultural separatism in India as elsewhere. Tagore had argued that the idea of India itself militated against a culturally separatist view, against the intense consciousness of the separateness of one's own people from others, unquote. According to Tagore, a staunch advocate of pluralism, the fundament of Indian ethos ideally reflected his Jibon Devota principle, that is unity in multitude. Akshaya Kumar once again noted that in his translation, Tagore forewent the generic segmentation in Kabir's poems. And I quote once again, "Unlike many later translations, Tagore uses the plain term poem for any of Kabir's verse, be it a Shabad, a Ramani, or a Sakhi. Since Tagore preferred the performative factor in Indian folk tradition, he sourced his translations from the popular orally performed songs of Kabir instead of textual documentation. Insisted upon by Tagore, Khiti Mohan Sen translated to Bangla a number of orally performed Kabir songs, and Sen's compilation proved to be a major point of reference for Tagore's work. However, his choice of the original had stirred controversy. Later translators of Kabir, including Reverend Ahmad Shah, the compiler and translator of Kabir's Bijak, questioned the authenticity of Kabir's attribution of some of the verses translated by Tagore. The poet remained unperturbed, for the technicality and authenticity had lesser signification in his greater agenda that he intended to achieve through the translation of Kabir. He attempted at foregrounding that such delicate and intricate philosophy was deep-rooted in Indian folk culture, and religious syncretism was embedded within the psyche of the milieu in order to challenge the general colonizer's perception of the colonized territory as unenlightened, uneducated, and segregated. For a better understanding of Tagore's stance, here it is important for us to delve deeper into Kabir's idea of bhakti and how Tagore harbored a similar conceptualization of life and religion. A protest against orthodox Brahmanism, structured upon intense intellectualism of Vedanta philosophy, necessitated the medieval revival of bhakti, premised essentially on personal devotion and unconditional love for the devotee for the Almighty. Though Shankaracharya advocated the principle of monism derived from Advaita Vedanta, that is Nirgun Brahma, or the formless Brahman who's manifested through the sound absolute and resonated through the sound Om, his disciples Ramanuja and Ramananda preached the principle of dualism. Nirgun Brahma, the formless, and the Sagun Brahma, the form manifested through nature. Kabir, being a direct follower of Ramananda, therefore enriched his poems with both cosmic and anthropomorphic symbols, expressing his, and I quote from Evelyn Underhill, otherworldly passion for the infinite, the most intimate and personal realization of God. Underhill noted in the introduction to 100 Poems of Kabir that, and I quote, though such devotion is indigenous in Hinduism and finds expression in many passages of Bhagavad Gita, there was in its medieval revival a large element of syncretism, since Ramananda's philosophy was evidently inspired by Sufi mystics. Thus, she opined that Kabir exhibited, and I quote once again, in action that very principle of religious synthesis which Ramananda had sought to establish in thought, unquote. Underhill further observed, thus we find that some of Kabir's finest poems have as their subject the commonplaces of Hindu philosophy and religion, the Leela, the ocean of bliss, the bird of the soul, Maya, the 100-petaled lotus, and the formless form. Many again are soaked in Sufi imagery and feeling, while others use as their material the ordinary surroundings and incidents of Indian life, unquote. Kabir's belief that, and I quote once again, everything is a part of the creative play of God, and therefore, even in its humblest details capable of revealing the player's mind, echoed Tagore's concept of Jibon Devota that can be appropriately be deconstructed to the anthropomorphic Jibon and the cosmic Devota. In this context, Keshav Chandra Sen's foundation of a neo-Brahmo Samaj, popularly termed as Keshavism, influenced and steered young Rabindranath towards the kind of religious synthesis that Kabir had propagated in his era. Both the poets engendered a framework of belief instead of a framework of conventional religion and conjectured the reconciliation of the binaries, the paradoxes in him, Brahma, the ineffable fact. Returning to Tagore's implementation of the concerned philosophy, one might affirm that the poet was who was overtly proud of the cultural construct of his country, attempted at upholding the value of the same to an international audience as a response to the colonizers' perception of the colonized to be half devil, half child, borrowing Kipling's words. Indian religiosity has simultaneously been subjected to the Westerners' baffle and critique, its diversity symbolizing naivety and lack of intellectual enlightenment of the colonized natives. Tagore ensured the inessentiality of the cumbersome burden that the apparently altruistic British government had imposed upon itself in an attempt to liberate the colonized land from the aforementioned societal evils. Tagore's religio-political stance that identified a reality as one, an ultimate whole comprehending the multiplicity of existence, and I quoted this from one of Tagore's essays, is witnessed by his nationalist vision that rejected the idea of complete negation of Western influences. He emphasized upon a negotiation between the cultures of East and West, a cultural exchange derived from the connection and integration of the Western virtues preceded by value judgment. He wrote in the essay Towards Universal Man, if we do not come in contact with what is best in the Englishman, if in short the Indian and the Englishman stay apart, they will simply be objects of mutual repugnance. He disseminated among his fellow Indians. Subsequently, the poet upheld the excellence of Indian culture through his projection of another poet as an endeavor to invite the West for a similar blend of traditions instead of indulging in mutual repugnance stirred by their vilifying treatment towards the colonized Indians. The overarching syncretism in the credos of Kabir and Tagore might be hypothesized to be an implement of retort against the communal violence propelled by the hegemonic divide and rule policy introduced by the British government in India in 1905. Tagore insisted in The Religion of Man that, and I quote, in the social or political field, the lack of freedom is based upon the spirit of alienation, on the imperfect realization of the one, unquote. However, for Tagore, counter-violence was never an option. Deeply shocked by the involvement of tyranny and violence in the patriotic fervor of Swadeshi movement, Tagore concluded, and I quote once again, anger towards the British did not seem an appropriate response to the problem of empire. Something deeper and more transformative was required, unquote. Thus, Tagore highlighted the precise factor of communal harmony ingrained in Indian ethos that Amartya Sen propounded in his collection of essays decades later. Religious poets like Kabir or Dadu were born Muslim but transcended sectional boundaries. One of Kabir's verses declares, Kabir is the child of Allah and of Ram. He is my Guru, he is my Peer. They were strongly affected by Hindu devotional poetry and in turn profoundly influenced it. There is, in fact, no communal line to be drawn through Indian literature and arts, setting Hindus and Muslims on separate sides, unquote. Verified by Kiti Mohan Sen in Medieval Mysticism in India, Tagore employed the tale of a medieval poet of Muslim parentage employed the tale of a medieval poet of Muslim parentage, praising the all-encompassing benevolent Param Brahma in Hindi and Sufi metaphors in his verses, and the transference of the lore and verses across generations in the oral format to validate the integrity, solidarity, and fraternity ever ubiquitous in Indian spirit and ethos. In the context of Tagore's agency of championing Indian culture to the West, Michael Collins expressed, and I quote, Tagore visualized India as a commingling of various races and cultures, and he had a vision of national integration, which he called the ocean of humanity. But this special attribute of India would constitute his message to the world. The particular experience of India was an aspect of the universal, but one that had become lost or at least suppressed in the West, unquote. 100 poems of Kabir can therefore be located within the tapestry of post-colonial literature and in its eminence in the historiography of India determined. Distanced by centuries, yet connected by the wavelength of their doctrine, Tagore and Kabir were firm advocates of pluralism. A society characterized and strengthened by its diversity and divided by nothing would mathematically and ideologically tend towards the infinity, the absolute, the single reality, which is Tagore's Jibon Devota. Thank you.
Thank you, Anisha. That was a brilliant presentation. And
Thank you, ma'am.
And you, I'm sure, have raised a number of questions. Will the questions be asked right now, or will all the 4 papers be read first? Organizers.
That should depend on you, ma'am. If you select to do the questions now, or if you want to do the questions at the end of the session,
Why I think have the questions now. Say about 2 or 3 questions per speaker.
Yes, that's absolutely up to you, ma'am.
Yes, please read out the questions if there are any.
And in case you can also type your question in the chat box. We'll keep a close eye on the chat box. Shreyoshi, you too, please keep a close eye on the chat box in case there are questions in the chat box.
Questions in the chat box is best, I think.
Okay, ma'am.
Are there questions for Anisha? Anisha, let me ask you one question. I just want to learn that the philosophy of Kabir and the way it has been interpreted by Tagore is not only intellectually stimulating, but also it is almost sort of a cultural revolution, you could say, where the Allah and Ram are stated in the same breath, which is a difficulty even in 21st century India, a statement like that. So how would you consider Kabir's role in India in the 21st century? How relevant is he? Why don't we have statues of Kabir? Why is this relevance not being recognized? Because, as you said, he is a symbol of syncretism. He is about a plural society, and the inclusiveness of all intersections being given their recognition and due. If that is true, then why don't we have more of Kabir? Then, yeah, tell me.
Thank you for that question, ma'am. Actually, I had been pondering over it since today morning. And why we do not have statues of Kabir, or why we do not, emphasize more on Kabir's philosophy. Well, I do not want to bring in a lot of controversy, but then making it very subtle, it would actually jeopardize the entire political system of India right away. I mean, yes.
Yeah, I think
because they kind of built up their entire, in the 21st century, they built up their entire business on religious sectarianism, if I would rather say. Well, I think Kabir's relevance lies in the fact that the Hindu Muslims country, because I'm mentioning these two communities especially because they are in majority compared to the people of other faith, the citizens of other faiths. Communal problems, conflicts, violence have taken place a number of times since time immemorial, if I would say, and it continues today as well. But the fact remains that the two communities are still coexisting in this country, and they will continue to do so. And if I'm correct, I think they have been inhabiting the country together since 1191, when Muhammad Ghori invaded India. Mm-hmm. And slowly it has progressed. And there, I think, is relevance of Kabir, that the religious syncretism is embedded within the psyche of the Indian. Of the Indians, and it is a fundament of the Indian ethos. Therefore, the two communities will remain cohabiting the country this way for generations to come, even if they the conflicts are caused by certain individual principles and differences of opinion, probably, and but they have been living in this country, and they will continue to do so. I don't know if I could answer my question. If I could answer your question.
Yeah, very satisfactorily. Very good. And any questions for Anisha, or else we'll pass on to the next speaker? Madhuchanda?
Anything in the chat box? Shreyoshi, I don't see anything in my chat box. Shreyoshi, did you see? Shreyoshi, Morikini? No?
No. There are no questions in the chat box as of yet.
Yeah. Does anybody wish to ask a question? You can unmute yourself and ask it.
Or let them think, maybe right at the end. Oh, there is a
question. I'm Shudipta here.
Yes, Shudipta.
Hi.
Actually, I have just completed my PG in 2019. That's why I'm calling you by name. I want to ask that, do you think, I think that your paper is basically focusing on a kind of communal harmony that Tagore, by translating the works of Kabir, Tagore has tried to do. And are you trying to hint, as Sanjukta ma'am actually asked you, that the importance of or the relevance of your paper in today's world, are you trying to hint at this sort of communal harmony that we need to have right now?
That does not really, feature in my paper as such, but we can obviously, continue with the discussion and bring it to discuss its relevance in the 21st century. But what I tried to focus on in my paper is Tagore upholding religious syncretism or communal harmony and projecting it to the West, projecting it to the colonizers who believed in ruling India, the colonized land at that point of time, with their policies of divide and rule. Its divide and rule policy is extremely popular, and we use it as in our regular discourse as well, the term. But a divide and rule policy that was evident, overtly evident in 1905 with the Bongo Bongo Andolon, so on and so forth. It was always there, but then it became evident in 1905. So Tagore is projecting the fact that communal harmony is the basis of Indian ethos to the colonizers, as a resistance to their policies of divide and rule.
Okay, thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.
So if there are no further questions, we can move on to the next paper presenter.
Yes, the next paper presenter is in fact Shudipta Banerjee, who happens to be an independent research scholar, and her paper is titled From Margin to the Center, Revisiting Tagore and His Translations. Over to you.
Shudipta, looking forward to your paper, and all about time. Yes.
Okay, am I audible and visible, because I am unable to see myself on the screen?
I can see you, and you're looking fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Okay. Good afternoon, all the eminent speakers, scholars, participants. I'm blessed and thankful to DESNU and SIL-SNU for giving me this privilege to take part in this clustered webinar. I am Sanjukta Banerjee from Kazi Nazrul University. I have completed my master's in the year 2019 and qualified NET in the same year. Right now, I am an open research scholar. I have just changed the title of my paper a little bit, and I've added a sentence right before from margin to center, and the sentence go like this: perceive the way you want, from margin to center, reading Tagore and his translations. I have divided my paper under 4 brief headings. Number 1, Tagore concept of translation. Number 2, Tagore's view regarding the problems of translation. Number 3, taking cue from William Radis' view regarding retranslation of Tagore's Gitanjali. And number 4, viewing Tagore from a deconstructive and post-colonial angle. Now moving straight into my paper, আমার প্রাণের মানুষ আছে প্রাণে তাই ফিরি তাই সকল খানে আছে সে নয়ন তারায় আলোক ধারায় তাই না হারায় ওগো তাই দেখি তাই যেথায় সে তাই তাকাই আমি যেদিক পানে. The man of my heart dwells inside it, so I see him wherever I see. He is there within my eyes itself, like a fountain light, so I never have to miss his sight. These lines are bearing the spirit of my Tudor's paper. To walk about Praner Manush has always been a very tough job. To talk about Robi is always like throwing a handful of rice into ocean and then searching for it. But still, always this journey of delving deep into the ocean results in an experience that is always unknown and unparalleled. For last few decades, Tagore's translated works and the debate of form versus content has received new dimensions. Arguments are going in favor and against of this. But as I have already said, I see him wherever I see. Before going into quality versus quantity debate, what I prefer to do is to visit the genesis of this debate. My search led me to revisit Robi's concept and views regarding translation. Though translation as an interlingual communication has existed among mankind from time immemorial, its study as an academic subject began only in the second half of the 20th century. Since the mid-1940s and the early 1950s, translation, as James S. Holmes suggests, has transformed from the traditional language traditional language learning exercise into a scholarly academic pursuit and emerged as an independent academic discipline in the 1980s. When all these developments in the field of translation were taking place in the Western world, in run-up to the emergence of translation studies as an independent discipline, Tagore had already left the whole scene. But so far as the study of translation is concerned, Tagore's role is pioneering. But the scholars of Eurocentric translation studies did not have any scope of knowing the maiden attempt made by Tagore in beginning the study or discussion of translation in India in its rudimentary form and took the shape of a full-fledged course in the West towards the closing decades of the 20th century. Tagore seems to have a concept of translation at the back of his mind when he was engaged in translating his Bengali songs and poems from the English for the English Gitanjali Songs of Offering 1912. But he never left behind any discourse on translation after the fashion of Walter Benjamin and Derrida. After his winning of Nobel Prize in 1913, he became an overnight literary celebrity. He had to face many queries regarding his translated works, and he had to satisfy them with miracle of translation. Chanchal Kumar Brahma is probably the first to have made a brief discussion of Tagore's translation thoughts in his Englanded Diktanto Uday Robir Osto, 2000. Many of modern ideas and concept of translation foreshadows Tagore's concept of translation. Translation as concept by Rabindranath is basically a rewriting or a reincarnation of the original text. In his letter to Indira Devi, 1913, Tagore writes, recalling his experience of translating his Gitanjali poems. He writes, underquote, I took up the poems of Gitanjali and set myself to translate them one by one. You may wonder why such a crazy ambition should possess me. I did not undertake this task in a spirit of reckless bravery. I simply felt an urge to recapture through the medium of another language the feelings and sentiments which had created such a fist of joy within me in past days. What Tagore wanted, quote close, and then it continues, what Tagore wanted was to recapture the creative mood as a kind of aesthetic experience. In another letter to Ajit Kumar Chakraborty, dated 13 March 1913, which remained the seminal text of Tagore's concept of translation. And I must say or make an input that I have become a fan of this expression because it has a very romantic sort of expression actually, a kind of little bit of romantic. Ever since I came to Urbana, I have spent my mornings in writings, underquote, it goes like this, the letter runs like this, that ever since I came to Urbana, I have spent my mornings in writings out my lecture, in prose, and the rest of the day in translating my poems. It is the translating of my poems which pleases me the most. It simply seizes me like an intoxicant. To me, it is the reception of the bridal pair following the ceremony of marriage. The marriage has been ritualized, but the bride has to be introduced to the larger community. When the guests accept refreshments at the hands of the bride, the union of the man and the wife becomes an accepted fact of the world. When I wrote the poems originally in Bengali, it marked the union of the poet and his poetry. But when I translate the same, I virtually extend an invitation to others to come and partake of something at the bride's hand. It is happiness of another kind. Repeatedly, I am erasing and striking out, brushing up and chiseling, acting as if I am in a frenzy. Nobody here would accept that this are translation. No one would hear that this were originally written in Bengali. I intend to carry the essential substance of my poetry into the English translation, and this means a wide divergence from the original. Usually, a poem springing into expression into Bengali comes with all the playful amplitude of language and cannot resist a display of its patrimony in public, which for her is the bridegroom's family. But while traveling abroad, the same ornaments would become a burden and therefore to leave behind. I am engaged in divesting my poetry of its adornment. It has attired itself afresh, returning only its bridal veil. It has not turned European, however, by wiping off these essential signs of marriages, the auspicious marks of vermilion and iron bangle. Had these poems been mere translations, these poems would have had but a temporary stay at an inn in the course of their journey abroad. They should have conducted themselves in a manner suggesting an intention to go back home soon. The letter ends here. Quote close. In this letter, Tagore is describing his concept of translation and at the same time defending his mode of translating. He is describing a particular aspect of translation as well as the problem of practicing it. Tagore has differentiated between the word-for-word translation and rewriting or creative translation. The latter provides an aesthetic joy. In another letter to William Rothenstein, 30th December 1912, Tagore writes, "These poems of mine are very different from other literary productions of the kind. They are revelations of my true self to me. The literary man was a mere amanuensis, very often knowing nothing of the true meaning of what he was writing." Quote close. In another letter to Rabindranath Tagore, Tagore writes, "This translation of yours are like reincarnations. The soul has migrated from one body to another. It is not an act of craft, it is an act of creation." Quote close. In other words, the message or the spirit of the original is creatively migrated or transposed in a translation from one language to another. Tagore believes that the melody of the Bengali language and Bengali rhythm cannot be transferred to English, and that the entering of ideas into simple English can only bring out its inner beauty. Now, the first point, that is Tagore's concept of translation, I have covered it, and the second point begins, that is Tagore's views regarding the problems of translation. Tagore was sufficiently aware of certain problems that a translator and a translated works have to face. Firstly, the problem, language and culture. According to Ms. Bassnett, translation studies explores the process whereby texts are transferred from one culture to another. Tagore could not anticipate the cultural turn that translation would take in the time to come. Sometime in September 1914, he requested Edward Thompson, his first English biographer, to translate some of his short stories and bring out a selection that might appeal to the Western public. "Please make your own selection, for it is difficult for me to know which of my things will be palatable to the English test." Tagore's obsession to the palatability to the English test led Thompson to conclude that Tagore's treatment of his Western public has sometimes amounted to an insult to their intelligence. Even Victoria Ocampo, his Argentinian friend and admirer, once ruefully commented in a different context, "Tagore has doubt as to the Westerners' capacity of understanding Eastern thought." Second comes the decoding and the recoding. The second problem of translation actually is, or a translator face actually, is the decoding and the recoding problem. Writing to Kanti Chandra Ghosh about the translation of Umar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, Tagore comments in its foreword, "মূলের ভাবটা দিয়ে সেটাকে নতুন করে সৃষ্টি করার দরকার. One needs to recreate that with the feeling of the original. In the given lines, the process rewriting or recoding is underlined through words like recapture and recreate, whereas the term decoding implies the process of capturing the message inherent in the original, message that is to be written in the target language. Then comes the problem of equivalence that a translator faces while rendering a text from one language to another, is that of equivalence. Written in 1917 for the students of his school in Shantiniketan, he says, "দুই সম্পূর্ণ বিভিন্ন ভাষার মধ্যে কথায় কথায় অনুবাদ চলতেই পারে না। ইংরেজি ও বাংলা দুই ভাষায় প্রকাশের প্রথা স্বতন্ত্র এবং পরস্পরের মধ্যে শব্দের ও প্রতিশব্দের অবিকল মিল পাওয়া অসম্ভব। A word-for-word rendering cannot be done between two languages, completely different from each other. The methods of expression between English and Bengali are different. It is therefore difficult to find complete equivalence between their words and their synonyms." And then another problem is the problem of loss and gain is also touched by Tagore. Tagore, in his letter, touches upon the issue of translation loss but does not undermine translation itself. Tagore has time and again emphasized the creative power of translator for the success of translation. A successful work of translation is that in which the translator exercises this creative power while transferring the message from the source language to the target language. The second topic I have covered, and the third heading goes like William Radis's view regarding reincarnation of Tagore's Gitanjali. Taking cue from William Radis's Gitanjali Reborn, Radis says that Gitanjali, Songs of Offering, as translated by Tagore in his famous book of 1912, has been with us for a century and has been further translated into all the major languages of the world. It is a book that many readers feel that they already know. On the occasion of the 150th anniversary of Tagore's birth, Radis offered Gitanjali in a new form. He further says that if Gitanjali is to win new readers and admirers in the second century of its existence, it needs to take an avatar that is suited to our age, as well as restoring to Tagore the real Gitanjali, a poetic endeavor that he cared about deeply, but which Yeats editing, the Nobel Prize, the numerous secondary translations, and the canonical status that it acquired rather took out of his hand. Radis, in the introduction of his retranslated text, also says that Gitanjali is perhaps the one text that has gained popularity in translations more than its original. And the last topic to be touched for today is viewing Tagore from a deconstructive and a post-colonial angle. Trying to view translation from Derrida's lenses. According to Derrida, every translator is in a position to speak about translation. For Derrida, translation is none other than transformation, albeit a regulated one, because equivalence is virtually impossible. Derrida argues that translation arguments and modifies the original, which insofar as it is living on, never ceases to be transformed and to grow. It modifies the original, even as it also modifies the translating language. This process of transforming the original as well as the translation is the translation contact between the original and the translating text. Derrida in 1985, under bracket. Then, trying to view Tagore's plethora of works, his concepts, philosophies, from Hamid Dabash's viewpoint, chiefly resting on his marked work, Can the Non-European Think? Dabashi here raises a vital question that what happens to the philosophers and the thinkers who operate outside the European philosophical pedigree? Why is it that if Mozart sneezes, it is music, but the most sophisticated Indian music ragas are the subject of ethnomusicology? There is an extract from Dabashi which runs like this: the trajectory of contemporary thinking around the globe is not spontaneously conditioned in our own time and disparate locations, but has a much deeper and wider spectrum that goes back to the earlier generations of thinkers, ranging from Joseph Marti to Jamal al-Din al-Afghani to Amir Cesare, W. Du Bois, Bianca Pichabo, Franz Fanon, Tagore, Mahatma Gandhi, etc. My task in this paper is to locate the Tagore amidst this thinker and trace him back to his obsession with palatability of European taste, as mentioned by his biographer and Okompo. Another thing that has came to my mind while writing this paper is I felt that somehow in this novelization of Tagore, there is a globalization of Tagore. In this very text, there is a mention of Gramsci's prison notebook, where we're talking about Kant's maxim, Gramsci is speaking about philosophy of the intellectuals in the cosmopolitan stratum. Tagore had a cosmopolitan outlook. I attempted to view this, then the next thing that I've done actually, I attempted to view this entire thing from Haber's idea of mimicry. Mimicry is a disciplined imitation of the white man by the native. The native has been taught consistently that he needs to try and ape the white man and his culture. However, Haber sees this as a site where colonial authority, rather than being reinforced, actually breaks down. Tagore evidently surpasses the ethnographic case. The entire idea of mimicry has been subverted in the context of Tagore.
Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are really running short of time.
I would request you to conclude the paper.
I have only 3 lines to complete.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. The colonial master is following the native's footsteps. Though it is difficult to compartmentalize Tagore, but somehow it is through his works that the country and its people receives a voice in the Vishwamancho. Why Ravi is always a Thakur to us? Because in his work, there is a divine charm that every human, irrespective of national boundaries, feels united with. Tagore is the praner manush of every pran that beats irrespective of class, caste, color, gender, geographical binaries. I will conclude by a line of Ravi's song, Amaro Porano Jaha Chai, Tumi Tai Go. Thank you.
Thank you, Shudipta. That was a very loaded paper. You
Thank you, ma'am.
Brought in Derrida, Radice, Gramsci, Bhabha, and of course Tagore, and the people who have corresponded with. I'm sure there are a number of questions for you. Please keep the questions short, and your answers also should be short because we are running late.
I will try to answer the questions, but if I am unable, then I will mail the organizer my answers.
Okay. You're well organized. I understood that. In your paper presentation, you said, I've finished the second part. Now I'm going to the third part.
Thank you.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you, ma'am.
So, anybody? Any questions? Monikinkini and Modhuchanda. Questions for Shudipta?
Any questions? I don't see any in the chat box yet.
Yes, the chat box doesn't have questions. I think people are going to unmute and ask questions.
Yeah.
No
Is
questions.
anyone any questions from the participants, fellow presenters?
The participants are absolutely spellbound. No questions? So should we go over to the third?
I think, sorry, ma'am. Sorry to interrupt you so much. There is a question.
Okay, very good.
Okay, should I read it out, ma'am? Can you?
Yes. Actually, I have already read it, and the question goes like that. Can you please explain where the center and the margin are in Tagore's translation? Yes, I am actually explaining it to you that I have just, when I was writing the abstract, I have written it in a very post-colonial angle. And when I entered and was busy writing this paper, that's why I added the line before from margin to center, and I've added that perceive the way you want. Okay, my perception has been in this way, and I have wanted to say that as Tagore, when Tagore was translating Gitanjali, because he just spoke of his poetry, and when Tagore was translating Gitanjali, during that time, India was under colonial rule, and so definitely we were in the margin to the center. Center obviously referred to the Occident here.
Hello, Shudipta. Unfortunately, you're not audible. Sorry. Could you repeat the last sentence? You were not audible.
I said that when Tagore was translating Gitanjali, at that period of time, India was under colonial rule, and therefore I wanted to show my angle in the very preliminary of this paper, or in the post-colonial angle of my paper is like that during that period.
Once again, I think there's some problem with the audio.
Yeah, I think, ma'am, if yes, I think if there is a problem with the audio, yeah, I think you can.
Ms. Banerjee, could you please just stop the video in case it is interrupting the audio?
Yes, and I think, ma'am, with your Sanjukta, ma'am, with your permission,
shall I mute mine too?
No, it's okay, ma'am. With your permission, can we move on to the next presenter, and while Shudipta ma'am can write her response in the chat box?
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you, Shudipta. And next time when you think in terms of post translation, notice how gendered his use of the Bengali language is. It is always
Sure, ma'am. Sure. Sure, ma'am. Thank you for giving me
and the Bengali language has no gender, but Tagore is making the Bengali language very gendered. Yes?
Sure. Okay, sure, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So the next presenter is Dr. Iram Fatima, Assistant Professor, Ramanujan College, University of Delhi, and the paper is titled "Exploring and Highlighting Rabindranath Tagore's Enchantment and Preoccupation with Death in Prantik."
Good noon to all the esteemed academicians. This is Dr. Iram Fatima, and I'm working as an assistant professor at Ramanujan College of University of Delhi. The title of my paper is Exploring and Highlighting Rabindranath Tagore's Enchantment and Preoccupation with Death in Prantik. Rabindranath Tagore's fascination and enchantment with the theme and motif of death in his works had its origin in a scaring and agonizing event of his life during his youth. The suicide of his muse and the love of his life, his sister-in-law Kadambari, 3 months after the poet's marriage at the age of 23. In his first autobiography, written at the age of 50, he has written, quote, "I had seen nothing beyond life and accepted it as ultimate truth," unquote. For Tagore, death was the ultimate truth and destination of life. Prantik is a slim volume of 18 short poems. It was penned down after his illness of September 1937. In September 1937, he had suffered a serious illness and through a sheer miracle had survived. During his last 5 years, he was racked by illness, pain, and disillusionment. But these were also years of an increasing self-awareness. On 10 September 1937, Rabindranath Tagore, poet, painter, philosopher, educationist, and perhaps the greatest multifaceted genius India has produced in the 19th and 20th centuries, fainted suddenly due to an attack of erysipelas. He was 77 years old. Since there was no telephone in Shantiniketan in rural Bengal where he lived, he was in a coma for 60 hours before a medical team arrived from Calcutta and he began to respond to the treatment. On 15 September, propped up on pillows, almost the first thing he did was ask for a brush and colors and paint a landscape on a piece of plywood. He noticed lying in the room, quote, "a dark wood with streaks of yellow light breaking through its gloom," unquote. A painting, one of his many biographers called remarkable and obviously symbolic. On 25th September, he wrote the first poem of a cycle of 18 poems on life and death, dying and after death, published under the title Prantik, the last one written on 25th December 1937. These poems, translated from their original Bengali by Tagore himself, are some of the finest meditations on death and after death in world literature. Besides the fact that poetry is notoriously difficult to translate, especially from a non-European language into a European one, and that Tagore's unrepentant romanticism may be alien too much of contemporary sensibility, the English translations of Prantik and other poems in this essay also suffer from the drawback that Tagore was an indifferent translator. But as the poet and translator of some of the Tagore's poems, William Radis observes, even the best of translators would have struggled with reproducing into English some of the characteristics of Bengali, such as, quote, its rich sound patterns exploited to the full by Tagore, its elegantly economical and regular inflectional system, or its abundance of vivid onomatopoeic words, unquote. Prantik literally means borderland. It dramatizes the poet's struggle with himself. Face to face with death, the poet has intensely realized the thrill of being alive, the blessedness of this life. The poems move between the polarities of darkness and light, of life and death, and finally celebrate the man undefeated. The heart of these poems, of course, lies in the mystery of the great unknown. At times, there is a regret at the loss of joy and purity. The past is withered, hence a break with it is essential. The next poem in the series explores the nature of freedom, which we are told is not the denial of self, but the celebration of self. You are free only when you are part of the world. The poet does not seek perfection and emptiness. Time has destroyed many unsung poems. It is in these unsung poems, however, that the poet finds fulfillment. He looks into the profound depths of his being in hushed wonder, throwing away the many trappings, the actor's mask. He strives to come to terms with the essential being. Let us now take a close look at frantic numbers 9 and 10. To me, these seem to be the central and most synoptic poems of the book. Number 9 is a kind of prayer to the sun, who has withdrawn to himself all his rays to let him see him, who is the self-same one in you and me. Quote, in the twilight of my dim consciousness, I see my body float by in the dark stream, carrying her gatherings of feeling, suffering, and remembrances. As she moves from the far to the far distance, her form fades, unquote. The next few lines take us to a familiar evening scene. Quote, the evening bells die out along the banks where shadows fall. From house to house the doors close, hiding the evening lamps. The boats ply no more, and the night thickens. Silent is the forest, with the hushed song of the bird. The universe offers itself in self-dedication at the feet of the great silence, unquote. The hushed song, of course, is the song of the poet, and the silence is not a void or a cessation. It is a great silence to which we offer ourselves in self-dedication. It is the silence when the poet has realized the truth of life and death. The words are unnecessary since they can hardly describe the terrible beauty of the great silence. The poem ends on a note of fervent prayer to him to reveal himself. The world is a splendid mystery for Tagore, and no reason can explain it. The veil of ignorance can be lifted only through revelation. The poet waits hopefully in hushed wonder for such revelation. Frantic number 10 was written on the same day as number 9. It deals with the sudden appearance of death and the poet's unpreparedness. Quote, Lord of destruction, your messenger of death came suddenly and brought me to the courtyard of your great hall. Before me, all was dark. I could not see the invisible light hidden in the heart of darkness, the light that is the splendor of the universe. My own shadow had obstructed my sight, unquote. Frantic number 14 has an agonizing immediacy since the time has come for the bird to depart. The weary journey on this side of death has come to an end. His voice is choked and his wings are powerless. But through all this, I am blessed with the glory of life, says Tagore. A careful reading of these poems reveals the poet's fascination with the silence, aloneness, and the remoter regions of starry heavens. Tagore was more interested in the remoter regions of starry heavens, the twilight of dim consciousness, than the humdrum of everyday life. He was, after all, a romantic at heart. It would be unfair to expect him to write like a full-blooded Marxist. He belonged to this earth and was painfully aware of the harsh realities of life, its many hungers, its violence and exploitations, its hurt and pain. Commenting on Frantic, one writer, Ghosh, writes, quote, it is written with his heart's blood and it has a disturbed and disturbing energy, rare in the entire range of Tagore's work. The architectural severity or compactness of its form, the hard rock-like quality of its words, is something new in Tagore, unquote. It is not in my contention that Tagore's fascination with the theme of death had its origin in the somatic occurrences of its near-death experience. The 60-hour sojourn in the borderland between life and death, which haunted the 3 months in which these poems and the painting were composed, all through his adult life, both in his prose and writings and in his poetry, death had been the recurrent motive of his meditations. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the author of the popular and widely influential On Death and Dying, believed that no one had thought more deeply on death than Rabindranath Tagore, and printed his quotations at the head of each chapter of her book. Tagore's preoccupation with death goes back to a traumatic event of his youth, the suicide of his muse and the love of his life, his sister-in-law Kadambari, 3 months after the poet's marriage at the age of 23. In his first autobiography, penned at the age of 50, he writes, quote, "I had seen nothing beyond life and accepted it as ultimate truth, when of a sudden death came and in a moment tore a gaping rent in its smooth-seeming fabric. I was utterly bewildered. All around, the trees, the soil, the water, the sun, the moon, the stars remained as immovably true as before. And yet the person who was as truly there, who through 1,000 points of contact with life, mind and heart, was ever so much more true for me, had vanished in a moment like a dream. What perplexing self-contradiction it all seemed to me as I looked around. How was I ever to reconcile that remained with which had gone?" Unquote. The terrible darkness which was disclosed to me through this rent continued to attract me night and day as time went on. I would ever and anon return to take my stand there and gaze upon it, wondering what there was left in place of what had gone. Emptiness is a thing man cannot bring himself to believe in. That which is not is untrue. That which is untrue is not. So our efforts to find something where we see nothing are unceasing. Just as a young plant confined in darkness stretches itself on tiptoe, as it were, to reach the light, so the soul, when death surrounds it with negation, tries to rise into affirmatory light. Yet, amid unbearable grief, flashes of joy sparkled in my mind on and off in a way which quite surprised me. The idea that life is not a fixture came as tidings and that helped to enlighten my mind. That we are not forever prisoners behind a wall of stony-hearted facts was the thought that kept unconsciously rising uppermost in rushes of gladness. Here, Rabindranath Tagore reminds me of the English poet John Keats, whose painful experiences of death of loved ones, father, mother, and brother, before his own first hemorrhage that was to kill him at the age of 25, led to an insight that is at the foundation of Keats' work, namely that life accrues value precisely to the extent that one intensely experiences its fragility and transience. The attempt to find a meaning in death is part of our universal heritage, as old as human consciousness of mortality. When Tagore gives this search, his imprint is in the insistence that death has a meaning because of the existence of life. Quote, "If to leave this world be as real as to love it, then there must be a meaning in the meeting and parting of life. If that love were deceived in death, then the canker of this deceit would eat into small things and stars would shrivel and grow black." Unquote. So I would like to end by saying that in his own quest for the meaning of death, Tagore rarely succumbs to the temptation of denying its death by imagining it. Thank you. I think I have completed with the time Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Fatima. That was a very, very interesting paper on
Thank you, ma'am.
basing on Prantik and also Tagore's lifelong preoccupation with the concept of death as a symbol, as a metaphor, as a life experience, and you have made this very, very valuable contribution to this webinar by talking about his poems published in Prantik. I have just one question about the Prantik translations. These were translated by Tagore or someone else? These poems that you read from, or are you the translator?
Ma'am, can you come again?
Yes, I just want to know that the 18 poems in Prantik, who is the translator, the poet himself? I think we will let her go.
Okay. Okay, ma'am.
Fatima, can you hear me? No.
No, I think maybe there's a problem with the connection.
All right. So, okay. So maybe if we have some time right at the end, we might ask her, or else then should we move over to the next speaker unless there are other questions for Fatima?
Any other questions for Fatima? We don't see any in the chat box, ma'am.
All right. So maybe we should go over to the fourth paper presenter.
Yes.
The final paper presenter.
Final paper presenter for the day.
The first day. Yeah.
Yes, the first day. It is Mr. Spandon Ghosh, who happens to be an independent research scholar. His paper is entitled Tagore, Einstein, Gitanjali or Song Offerings and Quantum Mechanics.
Good afternoon,
Welcome,
everybody.
Spandon.
Welcome, ma'am.
Introduce yourself and read your paper.
I have done my master's in English literature from University of Calcutta in 2019. And ma'am, I was there in your last classes of Paul Flanders.
Oh, thank you.
And the title of my paper is Tagore, Einstein, Gitanjali, Song Offerings, and Quantum Mechanics. And I begin. This paper will try to analyze our role in a perpetual cat and mouse game. Like the proverbial Tom and Jerry in pursuit of one another, we try to seek truth in the other. We work to make this truth indelible and independent so that the dream remains fortified. Keeping this subtext in the mind, Rabindranath Tagore and Albert Einstein on 19th August 1930 historically met for the last time to dissect the nature of reality. For Einstein, the identity of truth is independent, irrespective of the beholder. Tagore, on the other hand, critiques any idea of causal truth and sees the, within quotes, drama of existence as a constant harmony of chance and determination. It is this paradox that Tagore explores in his Song Offerings. It is also an ambiguity akin to quantum mechanics, and our task is to offer a correlation. The collection of poems capture a mood of disjuncture where the self is in constant desire for the other. And I quote from Song Offerings 13, "I live in the hope of meeting with him, but this meeting is not yet." What we immediately notice is a perpetual quest cut by a negation. Conventional criticism has associated this search with a spirit of divination. S. Radhakrishnan sees Tagore as a devotional poet and celebrates the collection as the, within quotes, offerings of the finite to the infinite. Echoing a similar spirit, Krishna Kripalini wrote, and I quote, "His religious poetry thus began as an intimate tete-a-tete with his deity, whose image, invisible, went on changing and assuming different aspects until it almost ceased to be independent of what he saw, heard, and felt. We are urged to locate a transgression from a self-centered universe to a God-centered one. The other, in such criticism, becomes a transcendental signifier with providential manifestations. We offer our reverence to God and hope for a becoming. The desire for a dream gets perturbed. Our task here is to obfuscate the quest motive and locate a disenchantment through quantum mechanics where the self never interacts with the other. Tagore in his collection captures the subject-object position in a state of quantum entanglement. In an entangled system, two particles reside in a well-defined joint state with its randomness. The particles, however, are devoid of any interaction. The self in the poems charts his unfulfilled desire of meeting and merging with the other. And I quote from Song of Rings 14, "Day by day thou art making me worthy of thy full acceptance by refusing me ever and anon." We notice a lack of deliverance as the other remains unresponsive. Karen Barad, the propounder of philosophy of physics, refers to this gap as dis/continuity. It is like two lovers talking wholeheartedly but never communicating, for words are worthless and they mean nothing. Love pertain constant othering. In love, we desire the other, we desire to become the other, and we desire what the other desires. We function through a sense of indebtedness, and Barad refers, and I quote, "Entanglements are relations of obligations, where separation is a kind of responsibility." Like Tom and Jerry, the I in the series of the poems must continue his struggle. Dissolution of identity is impossible because there is no end in desire. So what do we do with this endlessness? Should we remain satisfied with the little that we derive? How are we to measure this contentment? In an entangled system, the measurement of one particle disrupts the outcome of the other. In other words, if something external interacts with the system, there is a collapse of the wave function. That is, waves start behaving like particles. The result is disrupted and the dream gets perturbed. Tagore writes in Song of Rings 28, and I quote, "He came and sat by my side, but I woke not. What a cursed sleep it was, oh miserable me." The I regrets a meeting defined by separation. The sense of loss is imminent as the repeated reference to shadows keep them apart. His desire can never become his destiny, for the I is constantly trying to quantify his affinity for his Lord. Quantification through language disturbs this system, and the wish for dissolution becomes a shimmering dream. We are referring here to what Karen Barad calls an ontological im/possibility. To take a little detour, we use language to fulfill a kind of incompleteness prevailing in reality. It is because we are separated, we take recourse to language. Language masks but never bridges this gap. A lover expressing his love for his beloved is subconsciously reminding himself that the self is always separated from the other. Language thus constitutes an empirical reality, and the measurement leads to an adulterated system. Tagore, in Song of Rings 28, writes, and I quote, "Obstinate are the trammels, but my heart aches when I try to break them." The I is perhaps a prisoner to words and longs for a system devoid of external interaction. With the collapse of the wave function, the I can only interpret the state vector of his relationship in terms of an Hamletian aporia. The quantum sum becomes an or and never and. It's either him or his Lord. Language results in the inevitable power struggle. Since returning to a proto-real kind of pre-existence is impossible, the I can only dream of unification through death. Tagore repeatedly uses metaphors of death, and in Song of Rings 91, he notes, and I quote, "O thou the last fulfillment of life, death, my death, come and whisper to me." Death is like a quantum soup, where the I and his Lord can hope to remain in a state of superposition. In such a condition, Barrett observes that becoming/becoming, being/becoming is an indeterminate matter. It is a world that evades determination. It is a virgin system where becoming is an integral part of unbecoming. Self is merged into the other, where the perusal has ended and the I is in harmony with his Lord. But quantum superposition is a feeble state, and the particles eventually give way to external influence. Our reality perhaps is a collapse of the wave function. It is this because it is not that. Tom has to chase Jerry because he cannot choose anybody else, or simply let go the chasing altogether. Thus, the I in the collection of the poems has to wait for death, the only available option. However, the yearning for death is located in the use of future tense. Such futurity of the desired condition rests in uncertainty. This uncertainty has been continuously evoked by Tagore in the form of multiple questions spread across the collection. Death itself is uncertainty. It is a region of disorientation and bewilderment. But our bewilderment with life is as much because we cannot be certain about either life or death. Tagore, in Song of Rings 96, writes, and I quote, "In this playhouse of infinite forms, I have had my play, and here have I caught sight of him that is formless. Desire is amorphous, and is continuously fleeting. What is permanent is the desire supplied by language. One can only contemplate of an end. It is a system of entropy where the self and the other have been locked into. It is we who knock on the door, and it is we who come from the other side to open the same door. There is the presence of energy, but it is defunct. Quantifiable language has become the boogeyman haunting every system of representation." Returning to the title of the paper, Einstein was spooked by this eeriness of the quantum world. He believed that everything needed to be decided at the moment of creation. But in Song of Rings, the shift is into randomness. If the Lord referred to in the poems is the other, then the I desires to enter its womb, which is like a love tryst, referred to in Song of Rings 27. The womb, which is like the darkness of the night, again referred to in Song of Rings 27, has both an intrinsic and an extrinsic part. It is similar to a child unborn, a state of unification, and a child born. The desire of the I has always been to be one with the intrinsic part. The joy enunciated in the collection of poems is the pleasure attained while circling in the extrinsic part. Confusion is created as the self mistakes the outside for the inside of the other. It is the desire for recognition as well which results in resentment. We become victims of measurements where information is lost or confused. The I and his Lord are trapped in a state of quantum decoherence. In Karen Barad's words, it is a dis/orienting experience of dis/continuity and dis/jointedness. There is no meeting. We try to locate a paradox in love. The phantasmal image of the beloved must be sustained for the relationship to go on through the murder of resentment. Love is never coherent. It is violent. Rabindranath Tagore's Song of Rings discloses the strangeness in separability, and the synergy of meaning through death can only be achieved post-text. And I come to the end of my paper. But before I wrap up, I need to convey my thanks and regards. My debts are not many. I am grateful to Professor Dr. Shubit Dhar, not only for providing me with this opportunity, but also for constantly honing my academia. I am indebted to Professor Partha Mukherjee, whose formal tutoring for 5 years has ingrained life lessons within me. Words are insufficient to acknowledge the contributions made by Budhaditya Bhattacharjee. He is my brother, my teacher, and mentor for life. Last but not the least, this effort would have been impossible without the constant push delivered by my mother and my dearest friend, Depanna Ghosh. They are my entanglements. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Spandan. That was a fascinating presentation. And did you all say that you were a student of English literature?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, really? I thought you were from the Department of Physics.
No, ma'am.
So it's very interesting that for us, the very naive people, there is just one connection between those two disciplines. The literary genre poetry, the alphabet P, and physics, alphabet P. But you have really talked about entanglements and your own personal entanglements with which you also concluded. And it's a very, very thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you,
And
ma'am.
I'm sure there will be a few questions on your presentation.
Are there any questions? You can either type it or ask it. Ma'am, I think there is somebody had typed a question for Fatima. So if Fatima could reply maybe in the chat box.
Ma'am, she has replied in the chat box.
Oh, she has.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Suroshi. Thank you for that input.
I would like to interrupt the session for a second with Sanjukta's permission. May I, ma'am?
Yes, of course.
Ma'am, there is a feedback form in the chat box which the participants and observers need to fill out, not the paper presenters. The paper presenters don't need to fill out the feedback form. The participants and observers need to fill out the feedback form. Depending on that, we will have to disburse the certificates. If they could just do that after the session. Thank you. Over to you, ma'am.
Yes. So any questions for Spandan? You have caused quite some Spandan there with your presentation. I'm sure there are lots of ripples of questions that will be coming in. Any questions? Monikinkini and Madhuchanda, can you just check the chat box and tell us?
Yeah, just checking the chat box, ma'am.
Actually, there are no questions in the chat box.
Yeah,
I think people are going to just unmute themselves and ask questions if they want.
Somebody wants to? So, can I ask you a question, Spandan? While the others are probably organizing their thoughts and they will be asking you a question, could you clarify what you meant when you said that love is violent and it is not something that is absolutely one which is a free-flowing, spontaneous emergence of emotion?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, by love is violent, I try to mean that the idea of conception of love that we try to generate in our mind is quite dubious. Like we think that we try to communicate, or rather, we have so many things to say to our beloved. We have aspirations, we have dreams, we have proper ideation. And when we try to communicate them to our beloved, we find that there is a disjuncture. It's like I have said so many things to you, but at the end of the day, when I recollect, I find that I have said so many, but there are so many things left unsaid. So I am focusing on the disjuncture, which is very violent, which remains subjugated, which remains masked by relationship or proximity.
Is that why you talked about language being power struggle?
Yes, ma'am.
About that violence?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, because you are bringing in what to me as a feminist sounds like very patriarchal images that you are projecting on emotions which are regarded as so transcendent. Yes.
My role was simply to analyze language from a very disjunctive point of view, where words really do not mean anything. We simply speak, but we really do not communicate things.
So, without violence doesn't mean anything. Though, as you know, in COVID times, domestic violence has increased.
Yes, ma'am.
100-fold. And that is real violence.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, that's beside the point, really. But it was a very good paper. Any questions for Spandan now?
Yes, I think there is a question. Shutapa Chaudhary wants to ask Spandan. Spandan, could you enlighten us a little on social or historical entanglements of Tagore and Einstein?
Yes, Tagore and Einstein have been meeting for since 1929 until 1930. They met for 4 times, and like they have been exchanging views. But the most interesting thing is that we really do not have any record for 2 of their meetings. Like we really do not know whether Einstein or whether Tagore actually asked Einstein about what theory of relativity is. But what we come to know from Tagore's poem is that he had a certain perception of theory of relativity and quantum mechanics that was erupting during that time. Even Tagore had met Heisenberg in Calcutta in 1929. And to talk about the entanglement between Einstein and Tagore, their ideas of truth, their ideas of humanity have been very similar. For Einstein, the truth is very independent of the observer, whereas for Tagore, truth is correlated to the observer. It is through us that we measure our own reality. But the interesting point is that the idea of religion that Tagore himself propounds is the one among the many whom we must secure through introspection, is the same idea that Einstein had theorized when he was talking about special theory of relativity. He had referred to the idea of space and time being a constant element in the discourse of the universe. So he too has been figuring a constant one among many, like Tagore did in spiritual philosophy. So that is the entanglement, which has historical relevance.
Does that answer your question, Shutapa? All right. I think Shutapa is very convinced.
She says, yeah, very good, Spandan, she said.
Oh. So, anyone else with any questions to all the 4 paper presenters, now that we have a little time? Annesha, Shudipta, Fatima, and Spandan, all of you did a very good job of making these paper presentations so cool. It seems that you do webinars every day. You were so good, so much at ease. So, any more questions for the 4 paper presenters? So, over to Modhu Chanda and Modi Kinkini.
Ma'am, would you like to make any concluding comments? Today's session?
Yes, our emphasis, I think, in terms of the theme was on the English language and also on translations, transcreations, and also the ability of translation using a regional culture, a lesser known culture to the entire world. And of course, we know about the hegemony of the English language and how it can also be very dangerous in terms of cannibalizing regional languages, which is why many of the not so well-known languages are dying. And even what we consider to be major regional languages, especially ethnic languages, have now come into a huge competition in terms of remaining relevant in this so-called era of the internet and globalization, and the focus on these dominant languages, especially English, but there are other competitors, also European languages. And therefore, I think it is very necessary that we need to focus on translation so that our own regional literature, regional culture is not lost. And this is through both the process of appropriation and abrogation. It is not a surrender. And in that spirit, I think translation and transcreation should be regarded. Transcreation is also very much a part of even professional translation of creative writing. If it is a word-for-word translation or absolutely translation which is dependent on lexical interpretations, then the translation does not work. Tagore was at a supreme advantage because he could change things on his own. There was no issue of copyright. He could do everything he wanted with his own poems. But it is not possible when you're a translator of some other text written by somebody else. But at the same time, fidelity as well as the ability to bring in the free-flowing movement of the target language should be the target of all translators, whether it is a translation into English or even into another Indian language like Hindi. From Bengali to Hindi is easier because there are so many known signifiers. Yes, so many known words, so many shared words, and so much of shared culture. Yes, but then there are also differences. Like the Bengali Sandesh is not the Hindi Sandesh. Yes, so we have to be very, very guarded about translations. But at the same time, translation is the way forward. Thank you, Sarojini Naidu University, for giving me this opportunity to be amongst you and also talk about translation and Tagore. As you know, Sarojini Naidu was a great, is it Sarojini Naidu?
Nivedita.
Sorry. Nivedita was a great friend of Tagore. And so Nivedita herself had made a huge contribution in terms of introducing the East to the West. And I will not go into that anymore. You should have a seminar on Nivedita, really. And see how I messed it up by calling her Sarojini.
Oh, I think we are having a last-minute question for Spandan.
Okay, last-minute questions for Spandan. Spandan, are you there?
Yes, ma'am, I'm there.
Spandan, the question comes from Budhaditya Bhattacharjee, and he asks, with the construct of love being violent and how the constant approval of the I and the other is performed through the killing of resentment, what is death's role? Is it a clear sign of certainty?
Okay. In the collection of the poems, the idea of death that Tagore has prefigured is very uncertain. It's very ambiguous. He really does not know whether death will arrive at his door or not. He has been constantly pondering about death. He wants to be united with his Lord, and the only opportunity that he has got is to be at rest or at peace with death. To answer the question, the idea of resentment that I had talked about is that when we are in love, say for example Tagore and his beloved, the I and the other, whatever we are trying to express, we really do not fulfill in our expressions. we go back home and then we realize that there are many things that have been left unsaid. This sense of unsaidness, if there is a word like that, results in the idea of displeasure, which is resentment. To negate this resentment, what we have to do is that we have to constantly pretend. We have to keep pretending that we are all fine, and we have to keep talking to keep the relationship intact. Tagore has to keep on praying and offer his prayers to the Lord so that the Lord might come to him and meet him at death. But the point is that the idea of death in this collection is absolutely not certain, according to my interpretation of the text. But otherwise, if in life, death can be seen as an end, which is extremely, what should I say? Which is extremely resourceful. That's a bad word to use. Extremely overpowering, where every uncertainties and certainties collide and get mixed. But the fact is that we really do not know, because we cannot come back and inform how I have been while I have died. There is no, even if there is another world, we really do not apprehend that. If that answers your question.
Spandan, may I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So when you were talking about, it was quite interesting when you were talking about the concept of the I and the other in terms of love. And I couldn't help but think of a comparison with Browning and how he looks at death, or the lovers in Browning, and how they look at death as a sort of meeting point for the lovers, where they are parted in life, but once it is, whether we're talking about Porphyria's lover or Last Ride Together, the whole idea of murdering the beloved is really prompted by the fact that the lover is consumed by this idea that once the beloved is dead, then you can unite completely. So, as you know, that Tagore was obviously influenced by Western tradition. So, in that sense, do you have any comment on how Tagore's idea of love and its relationship with death might be slightly different from Browning or similar to Browning? Have you
Browning,
about it?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Browning's idea of love was a kind of a full circle. I remember Professor Santayana, who had written extensively on Browning's idea of love. Browning's idea of love was very revolutionary. He used to see that our life is a full circle. The half circle is on earth and the other half is in heaven, if there is a heaven at all. We go on pretending with our lover that we fall in love, we talk, we interact, we enjoy our times. But the fact is that Browning, the points of Browning, we sense a desire for unification, and Browning has always mentioned this, that this unification is never possible in the state of half circle. We can only achieve this when we have killed, or we have terminated my love, so that love gets internalized through death. So in Browning, death has a sense of hierarchy, which is associated with killing. And for Browning, life is like a full circle. But again, the interesting thing is that when I have completed my half circle and through death I enter the other half, but I really do not come back to provide people with opinions whether I was at one with my lover or not. The same idea of the full circle can be interpreted in terms of Tagore also, but the contradiction is that Tagore, we do not really find death in Tagore's poems. There is longing for death, but death really doesn't arrive. But in Browning's poems, there is the proper mention of death, and the beloved dies there. So death triggers a kind of immortalization of love. But we really do not know the case of Tagore, whether the love for the Lord is at all immortalized or not, whether it will simply remain as an introspection. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Spandan. Let me just quickly check the chat box in case there are any more questions for anyone else. Monikinkini, could you just help me out as well? Do you see any
I think Buddhaditya Bhattacharya has another question, an observation maybe pertaining to the paper.
Yeah, Buddhaditya Bhattacharya has an observation, I think, a comment on the paper. The absence of knowledge pertaining to the netherworld doesn't really signify the disorder in death. In fact, it resonates the factor of absolute meaning in a nihilistic fashion. Death is not unification or order. Death is not chaos. Death is just like time, decided at the moment of creation.
Okay.
So, yeah, that was first Pandon.
Yes, I agree with the observation. I have to think upon the observation.
All right, so if there are no more questions for any of the paper presenters, I suppose we should move towards the conclusion of this session.
And is Shubir there? Then he probably will.
And Dr. Chattopadhyay, our VC sir. Moni Kinkini.
Yes, I can see Professor Dhar is there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know why it echoed like that.
With so much of talk about the netherworld.
Before I ask you to conclude, Monishanda, I just want to say a word. Obviously, to thank everyone who was associated with this. And obviously, and I'm sure you can thank her once again, but she deserves all the thanks we can give her. Certainly to Professor Sanjukta Dasgupta. You did it marvelously, like the pro that you are. And so thank you very much. From DESNU, incidentally, this Department of English, Sister Nivedita University. That's our action. And SNU, which is the School of International Languages, Sister Nivedita University. Thanks a lot. And we hope that we'll have you back once again. And incidentally, we did plan to have a full-fledged seminar on Sister Nivedita. In fact, the working title that we have thought of was Sister Nivedita and Colonial India, Colonial and Post-Colonial India. So, once again, so that's somewhere there at the back of our minds. And when the time comes, maybe we can certainly do something on that. And once again, that is to be a clustered website because there's so much to think about, so much to discuss, so much to debate, and finally, so much to decide upon insofar as Sister Nivedita, who is one of the, less worked on icons of that glorious era, which is a pity. I think we need to present her, highlight her more in today's world. Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shubidhar, for the opportunity, and my apologies of messing up the acronym. When I saw SNU, suddenly it became Sarojini Naidu. And both the ladies were really very, very powerful ladies, and they will not like it at all. So they are having a battle wherever in the world they are, in the netherworld, according to the discourse we were hearing now. And yes, it's been a wonderful opportunity, and I learned a lot from all the papers that were presented today. Thank you.
And for everyone who's still with us now, just have a couple of words. Check out the DESNU Facebook page, because you see the page, and we would like it very much if you start, following us. We also, the whole session is technically the full session was there on YouTube in the live mode. So maybe later on you can listen to the papers once again, your questions, your responses, and sort of take part. The other thing is, please look at the SNU-SIL, Sister Nivedita University School of International Languages Facebook page. There's another Facebook page, and we would love it if you start following that as well. More days of webinars, tomorrow Prose, and finally drama. Dr. Rajchodhuri said at the beginning, it's impossible to take even a synoptic view of a portion that is Rabindranath Tagore. But that doesn't matter. What matters is we are making an effort. People are writing on Tagore. People are thinking about Tagore. And as I said, this kind of an opportunity is a learning opportunity for all of us. Very senior people like us and very young people like many of you in this webinar. This is what is important in a webinar. That is, this becomes a platform where we enrich each other, when we garner ideas, when we think sometimes in very unexpected ways. And I think that's all. Dr. Rachaudhuri, over to you, concluding.
Thank you so much, sir. And I would not take up much of your time because I think we are nearing the lunch hour, but we really can't end the session without thanking a few people. Of course, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, I think Shubir sir was very, very right in saying that he's one of the most inspiring Vice Chancellors that we could have asked for. He's always gung-ho about any kind of new ideas that can push us forth in the academic frontier. So thank you so much, sir, for being a constant source of inspiration. Our registrar, sir, the quiet worker who's just silently, keeping the whole place up, working quietly in the background. He really comes forward, but we could not have, really stood on our feet without his tireless effort. So our dear registrar, sir, Professor Shumon Chattopadhyay, we can't thank you enough, sir, for all the support that you provide us from the background. Of course, Professor Dr. Shubir Dhar, who we fondly call our guardian angel, who keeps us young guns. I think he's the youngest at heart amongst the DESNU family and I'm sure in the SIL family as well. He's the youngest and he keeps us all alive in every sense of the word. So thank you so much, sir. Sanjukta ma'am, I don't think we can thank you enough for taking time out and doing this session for us, staying with us for so long, enriching us with your erudition. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, ma'am, and we've learned so much, and I'm sure that goes for the DESNU faculty, the students, the scholars who've presented, and the other faculty members as well. The presenters, thank you so much for opening up new avenues to look at Tagore and for your contribution. The participants, and before I thank my students, let me just thank my fellow colleagues, our technical team, without whom this would have not been possible, which is, Professor Orko Prabhu Chakraborty, who loves to hide behind the shadows. But Orko, if you could, just for 1 sec, I don't know if you can show your face. Please show your face. We would love to see your face. Well, if you're not comfortable, then I won't push you. Orko loves to work in the background, but he is really our backbone in terms of technology. And so is Moni Kinkini, because the head of the department is a bit technologically retarded. So I rely heavily on them. Our two colleagues, Dr. Prashanto Ghoshal and Shudesha, again, two very quiet workers, do not really come to the forefront. Shudesha, in fact, designed one of the posters that went up on Facebook. So I have to acknowledge that, Shudesha. She's masterful at sketching, and Tagore is one of her special interests. And of course, Prashanto, for your constant support. So that's the DESNU family for you, the professors. And of course, our students, the silent stars, the stars who often hide behind the mists, but without whom this would not have been possible. They just do the running around, metaphorically speaking, whenever and in whatever hour we ask them to, and at whatever time we just pounce on them and say, you have to do this, and they are completely game about it. So we could not have